Sometimes the people who lose everything are the only ones destined to find what truly matters. The night Wyatt Brooks was told to leave, the Montana wind moved across the valley like a restless spirit, carrying the scent of snow and pine through the darkness. The old farmhouse stood beneath a pale winter moon, its weathered boards silvered by frost, quiet and familiar in a way that only places filled with memories could be. Wyatt stood near the front door, with a worn duffel bag hanging from one shoulder. At 40 years old, he looked like a man carved from endurance itself. Broad-shouldered and tall, with gray-blue eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little, he carried the quiet stillness common among those who had learned long ago that pain rarely announced itself with words. His dark brown hair, touched with silver at the temples, caught the porch light as he glanced one final time across the room where he had spent most of his life. Across the kitchen stood his older brother, Derek Brooks. The inheritance papers rested on the table between them. The ink was dry. The decision had already been made. Their father had been gone less than a month. Yet somehow the house already felt different, as though the walls themselves knew something had ended. Derek folded his arms and avoided Wyatt's eyes. Beside him, his wife Vanessa stared into a cold cup of coffee. Neither looked angry. Somehow that made it worse. There was no argument left to win, no discussion left to have. Only an ending waiting to happen. Wyatt's gaze drifted toward the window above the sink. Beyond the glass, snowflakes floated down through the darkness. He remembered being 8 years old and watching the same snowfall beside his father. He remembered repairing fences, hauling hay, fixing machinery, and learning every inch of the ranch long before he was old enough to drive. Yet none of those memories seemed to matter now. Derek cleared his throat. "You should go before the storm gets worse." His voice was flat, almost uncomfortable. Wyatt nodded once. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. The ranch belonged to Derek now. The house belonged to Derek. Even the future seemed to belong to someone else. At Wyatt's side stood Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat seemed almost silver beneath the kitchen light. The dog hadn't moved in several minutes. His amber eyes shifted slowly between the two brothers. His ears remained upright, alert, listening, watching, as though he understood far more than anyone expected. Wyatt reached down and rested a hand against the dog's neck. Shadow leaned slightly into the touch, but never looked away from Derek. The clock above the refrigerator ticked softly. Somewhere outside, the wind pressed against the old walls. Wyatt picked up his duffel bag and walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one called his name. The silence behind him felt heavier than words ever could. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in immediately. Snow swirled across the porch in pale ribbons. The darkness beyond stretched endlessly toward the mountains that rose along the horizon like sleeping giants. Shadow stepped outside first, his paws pressed into fresh snow. Wyatt followed and pulled the door shut behind him. The sound echoed softly through the night. For a long moment he stood there beneath the porch light, staring into the storm. He had no destination, no plan, no place waiting for him. The only thing he knew for certain was that he wasn't welcome here anymore. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder and started down the path leading away from the house. Shadow followed for several yards before suddenly stopping. Wyatt took a few more steps before noticing. He turned around. The German shepherd stood perfectly still. His body faced neither the road nor the town beyond the valley. Instead, Shadow was staring toward the distant mountains. His ears twitched, his tail lowered slightly. The wind carried a low whisper through the trees. Wyatt frowned. "Come on, boy." Shadow didn't move. He simply continued watching the dark wilderness beyond the ranch, as though something hidden there had just called his name. Wyatt stared at Shadow for several seconds while snow drifted between them. The German shepherd remained motionless, his amber eyes fixed on the dark line of mountains beyond the valley. The road toward town stretched behind them, marked by faint tire tracks disappearing beneath fresh snow, but Shadow showed no interest in following it. "What is it, boy?" Wyatt asked quietly. The dog flicked one ear but did not look away. The wind moved through the pines with a low whispering sound. Shadow took 3 slow steps forward toward the wilderness, then stopped and glanced back. Wyatt let out a tired breath. "You cannot be serious." Shadow responded by walking another few yards into the snow. Wyatt shook his head. After everything that had happened, the idea of wandering deeper into the mountains, in the middle of a storm, seemed ridiculous. He looked back one final time toward the farmhouse. A single light glowed from the kitchen window. For a moment he imagined his father sitting there sipping coffee before dawn, talking about weather forecasts and broken fences. The image faded as quickly as it appeared. There was nothing waiting for him there anymore. Shadow barked once, not loudly, just enough. Wyatt laughed softly despite himself. You always did have opinions. The dog's tail moved once. Wyatt adjusted his duffel bag and stepped forward. Fine, we do it your way. Together they left the road behind and entered the trees. Snow muffled every sound beneath their boots and paws. The forest seemed larger at night, endless and silent except for the creaking branches overhead. Shadow moved confidently through the darkness as if he had traveled the path before. Wyatt followed, watching the dog's silhouette weave between the pines. Nearly half an hour passed. The storm thickened. Snowflakes drifted across Wyatt's face and settled on his jacket. The temperature continued dropping. You know, Wyatt said, speaking mostly to keep himself company, most dogs would be looking for a warm garage right about now. Shadow continued forward. Most dogs are smarter than you. At that, the German Shepherd actually looked back. Wyatt chuckled. All right, maybe not. They climbed steadily higher. The valley disappeared behind them. At one point, Shadow stopped beside a fallen log and sniffed the air. His ears rose sharply. Wyatt noticed it immediately. Years of working beside animals had taught him when something changed. What do you hear? He asked. Shadow remained focused on the darkness ahead. The dog was not frightened. If anything, he seemed curious, determined, as if something unseen was pulling him forward. Another 20 minutes passed before Wyatt noticed something unusual. Through the snowfall, far ahead between the trees, stood a shape that did not belong. At first, he thought it was part of the mountain itself. Then the moon briefly emerged from behind the clouds and pale silver light spilled across the ridge. Stone, straight lines, a roof. Wyatt slowed. What in the world? Shadow immediately picked up his pace. The German Shepherd moved ahead with renewed energy, climbing toward the structure. Wyatt followed, his heartbeat quickening. The building grew clearer with every step. Thick stone walls rose from the mountainside, as though they had been carved directly from the rock itself. Dark windows stared into the forest. Snow covered the roof. No tracks surrounded it. No lights shone from inside. It looked forgotten, abandoned, hidden. Shadow stopped near the entrance and sat quietly before the heavy wooden door. Wyatt stared at the strange house in disbelief. Then the dog lifted his head and looked directly at him, almost as if he had been leading him here all along. The wooden door groaned softly when Wyatt pushed it open. A rush of cold air drifted out from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of old stone dust and something else he could not quite identify. Not decay, not moisture, just age. The kind of scent that belonged to places forgotten by time. Shadow stepped inside first without hesitation. His nails clicked against the stone floor as he moved through the entryway. Wyatt followed, pulling the door shut behind them. The storm immediately became distant. The silence inside the house felt almost unreal. Moonlight filtered through narrow windows, casting pale silver rectangles across the floor. Thick stone walls surrounded them on every side. Massive wooden beams stretched overhead, darkened by decades of weather and smoke. Well, Wyatt murmured, looking around. You definitely found something. Shadow continued forward. The house was larger than it first appeared from outside. A long hallway extended deeper into the structure. Several doorways opened into empty rooms. Furniture remained scattered throughout the house beneath thick layers of dust. A rocking chair sat near an old fireplace. Shelves lined one wall. A cast iron stove stood silently in a corner. It looked as though someone had simply walked away one day and never returned. Wyatt set his duffel bag down beside the fireplace. At least we are out of the snow. Shadow barely acknowledged him. The dog moved carefully from room to room, sniffing corners and studying every detail. His behavior reminded Wyatt of their old search exercises years ago. Focused, intentional, looking for something. Wyatt explored as well. In one room, he found faded curtains hanging beside cracked windows. In another, he discovered an old table covered with a thin layer of gray dust. Nothing appeared valuable. Nothing explained why such a house existed so far from civilization. Who built this place? He wondered aloud. His voice echoed softly through the stone structure. No answer came except the distant whistle of wind outside. Nearly an hour passed. Wyatt gathered firewood stacked beneath a covered section of the porch, and soon a small fire crackled inside the hearth. Warm orange light danced across the walls. For the first time that night, he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He sat near the fire and stretched his legs. Shadow remained standing, watching, listening. Then suddenly the German Shepherd froze. Wyatt noticed immediately. What is it? Shadow's ears rose. The dog slowly turned his head toward the far end of the house. A low sound escaped his throat. Not a growl, more like a warning. Wyatt stood. The fire popped quietly behind him. Shadow? The dog walked away without looking back. Wyatt grabbed a lantern from a nearby shelf and followed. They moved through the hallway and entered a room larger than the others. Empty shelves lined the walls. An old workbench rested beneath a window. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then Shadow stopped near the far wall. He stared directly at the stone surface, motionless. Wyatt lifted the lantern higher. "What are you looking at?" Shadow stepped forward and pressed his nose against the wall. Then he scratched once, pause, twice, pause, 3 times. Wyatt frowned. "You hear something?" The dog scratched again. Wyatt approached and placed one hand against the stone. It felt cold, solid, ordinary. Yet something about Shadow's reaction made him hesitate. He knocked lightly against the wall. Thump. He moved a few feet to the left and knocked again. This time the sound changed. Hollow. Wyatt straightened immediately. He knocked once more. Hollow. His eyes narrowed. The room suddenly felt much smaller, much quieter. Shadow looked up at him as though waiting. Wyatt slowly raised the lantern and examined the stonework more carefully. For the first time, he noticed a faint line running vertically between 2 sections of rock, almost invisible beneath years of dust, almost as if the wall was not really a wall at all. Wyatt stared at the faint seam running through the stone and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. For several moments, neither he nor Shadow moved. The fire crackling somewhere deeper in the house seemed impossibly far away now. "You knew something was here, did you not?" Wyatt asked quietly. Shadow responded with a short huff and pressed one paw against the wall. Wyatt shook his head and smiled faintly. "I should have known you were not dragging me through a snowstorm for shelter." He set the lantern on the workbench and ran both hands across the stone surface. Dust coated his fingertips. The seam continued from floor to ceiling, almost perfectly hidden within the masonry. Whoever built it had wanted it to disappear. Wyatt searched carefully along the edges until his fingers brushed against something different. A small metal ring concealed inside a narrow gap. His heartbeat quickened. "Well now," he pulled gently. Nothing happened. He pulled harder. A deep grinding sound echoed through the room. Stone scraped against stone. Dust drifted from above. Shadow immediately stepped backward, ears raised. Slowly, almost reluctantly, part of the wall shifted inward several inches. Wyatt froze. The hidden section was not a wall at all. It was a door. "You have got to be kidding me." The opening revealed a narrow darkness beyond. Cool air drifted out, carrying the scent of old earth and forgotten places. Wyatt lifted the lantern and peered inside. Stone steps descended into the mountain. The staircase vanished into shadows below. For a long moment he simply stared. His father used to tell stories during winter storms. Stories about miners, trappers, and pioneers who hid supplies in the mountains. Wyatt had always assumed they were just stories. Suddenly he was not so sure. Shadow moved closer to the entrance. His tail remained still, not fearful, curious. Wyatt looked at him. "You want to go down there, do not you?" The German shepherd stepped onto the first stair. "Of course you do." Wyatt laughed softly despite the tension. "You never pick the easy path." He picked up the lantern and followed. The staircase twisted downward through solid rock. Each step had been carefully carved. This was not a natural cave. Someone had spent years creating it. Their footsteps echoed softly through the passage. After nearly 50 feet, the stairs opened into a narrow corridor. The walls were lined with old lantern brackets. Most stood empty. A few still held rusted fixtures coated in dust. Wyatt paused and swept the light across the stonework. Then he noticed something that made him stop completely. A symbol had been carved into one section of the wall. A simple emblem formed from a mountain peak and a circle. His breath caught. He knew that symbol. Years ago, he had seen it engraved on the back cover of one of his father's journals. The same journal his father never allowed anyone else to read. Wyatt stepped closer. "That is impossible." Shadow stood beside him, watching. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. One evening years earlier, his father had sat on the porch staring toward the mountains. He had spoken a sentence Wyatt never forgot. "Some things are worth more than land, son. Most people spend their lives looking in the wrong place." At the time, it had sounded like nothing more than old wisdom. Standing inside the hidden corridor, Wyatt suddenly wondered if it had been something else entirely. Then Shadow lifted his head and looked farther down the passage. Another corridor stretched beyond the lantern light. Somewhere ahead, deeper inside the mountain, something waited. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly through the mountain. Wyatt moved slowly, lantern raised, while Shadow padded several feet ahead. The German shepherd's ears remained forward, every sense focused on something hidden beyond the reach of light. The air felt different here, still, ancient, as though no one had walked these passages for decades. Wyatt brushed his fingers along the stone wall and noticed more carvings appearing every 20 feet or so. The same mountain emblem, the same circle, always carefully etched into the rock. "Whoever built this place wanted people to find their way," he murmured. Shadow glanced back briefly before continuing forward. After several minutes, the corridor widened into a chamber. Wyatt stopped at the entrance. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Most were empty now, but a few still held old boxes, rusted tools, and weathered notebooks. Dust covered everything. Shadow immediately began sniffing around the room. His tail moved slowly, curious. Wyatt stepped toward one of the shelves and picked up a notebook. The leather cover cracked softly in his hands. He opened it carefully. The pages had yellowed with age. Most of the writing had faded, but several lines remained readable. His eyes moved across the page, then he froze. The handwriting looked familiar, very familiar. "No," he whispered. He flipped through more pages. The same handwriting appeared again. Wyatt's pulse quickened. This cannot be real. He sat down on an old wooden crate and held the notebook closer to the lantern. There was no doubt anymore. The writing belonged to his father, every letter, every stroke. Wyatt had seen enough notes and grocery lists over the years to recognize it instantly. Shadow approached and rested beside him. Wyatt stared at the pages. His father had written dates stretching back more than 20 years, notes about weather patterns, supply inventories, observations about the mountain. Entire entries filled the journal. One sentence immediately caught his attention. "If you are reading this, then the mountain has chosen you instead of me." Wyatt slowly lowered the notebook. The words echoed through his thoughts. What does that even mean? Shadow rested his head against Wyatt's knee. For a moment, neither moved. The silence felt almost sacred. Wyatt continued reading. More entries followed. His father described making regular trips into the mountain. He wrote about preserving family history, protecting something important, waiting for the right time. Yet every time Wyatt thought he was close to understanding, the journal became vague again, almost as if his father had intentionally hidden the truth. "You always did talk in riddles," Wyatt said quietly. Then another memory surfaced. He remembered being 17 years old. One summer evening, he had found his father standing alone near the old barn, staring toward the mountains. Wyatt had asked what he was looking at. His father had smiled and replied, "Sometimes the most valuable things cannot be seen from where you stand." At the time, Wyatt thought he was talking about life. Now he wondered if his father had been speaking literally. Shadow suddenly stood up. His ears rose sharply. Wyatt looked up. "What is it now?" The German shepherd walked toward the far side of the chamber, where a heavy wooden table sat against the wall. The dog stopped beside it and stared downward. Wyatt approached slowly. The tabletop was covered with maps, dozens of them. Some showed sections of the mountain, others showed surrounding valleys and trails. In the center rested a single folded document sealed inside a leather cover. Wyatt carefully opened it. The moment he saw the first page, his breath caught. Across the top, written in his father's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words, "For Wyatt Brooks only." Wyatt stared at the document for several seconds before carefully lowering himself into the chair beside the table. The lantern flame flickered softly, casting moving shadows across the stone walls. Shadow sat beside him, alert but calm, as though he understood the importance of the moment. Wyatt opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Son, if you are reading this, then life has probably taken a path I hoped it never would. I wanted to tell you these things myself. Perhaps I waited too long." Wyatt swallowed hard. The words felt less like a letter and more like a conversation, reaching across time. He continued reading. "There are truths hidden in this mountain that cannot be measured in dollars or acres. Most men spend their lives fighting over what sits on the surface. Very few ever look underneath." Wyatt exhaled slowly. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew all along." The next several pages described years of quiet work. His father had spent decades restoring forgotten tunnels, preserving records, and protecting something entrusted to the Brooks family generations earlier. Yet frustratingly, he still avoided naming exactly what that something was. Shadow suddenly rose and wandered toward another doorway leading deeper into the mountain chamber. Wyatt glanced up. "Not now, buddy." The German shepherd paused but did not return. Instead, he stood at the doorway, staring into the darkness beyond. Wyatt returned to the letter. One paragraph immediately caught his attention. "Never tell anyone about the lower chamber until you understand why it exists. Not even family, especially family blinded by ownership." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. "Lower chamber?" He flipped through the remaining pages. Maps, notes, directions. Then a rough hand-drawn diagram appeared. It showed the chamber where he sat, and another room far deeper inside the mountain. A red circle marked the final location. Beside it, his father had written only 3 words, "The last room." Shadow barked once. Wyatt looked up immediately. "You found something?" The dog disappeared through the doorway. Wyatt folded the document, slipped it carefully into his jacket, and grabbed the lantern. You never make anything easy, do you? He followed Shadow through the narrow passage beyond the chamber. The corridor descended gradually. The deeper they traveled, the cooler the air became. Stone walls gave way to larger carved sections, reinforced with timber beams. Someone had invested years of labor into this place. Eventually, the passage opened into another room. Wyatt stopped in amazement. Shelves filled the chamber from floor to ceiling. Wooden crates stood neatly stacked against one wall. Filing cabinets lined another. Maps, journals, records, photographs, and ledgers occupied every available space. It looked less like a hidden cave and more like an underground archive. Good Lord, Wyatt breathed. Shadow moved toward a cabinet in the far corner and sat beside it. Wyatt approached. Unlike the others, this cabinet appeared newer. A small brass plate had been attached to the front. Dust covered most of it, but one word remained visible: legacy. Wyatt slowly opened the top drawer. Inside lay dozens of documents organized into folders: land surveys, property deeds, historical records. Many carried the Brooks family name. Others belonged to neighboring families throughout the valley. Wyatt pulled one folder free and opened it. His eyes widened immediately. These were original ownership records dating back nearly a century, records many people believed had been lost forever. He looked around the room in disbelief. Dad, what exactly were you protecting? Then Shadow stood abruptly. His ears lifted, his body became completely still. Wyatt followed the dog's gaze across the room. Hidden behind a row of filing cabinets stood a heavy steel door set directly into the stone, and above it, carved into the rock, was the same mountain symbol they had followed all night. Wyatt approached the steel door slowly, the lantern trembling slightly in his hand. The carved mountain symbol above it seemed older than everything else in the chamber, worn smooth by time yet somehow more important than any document surrounding it. Shadow stood beside the entrance, completely focused on the door. His ears remained forward, his body was still, waiting. Wyatt ran his hand across the cold steel surface and immediately noticed something unusual. There was no visible lock, no handle. Nothing except a narrow metal plate mounted near the center. He brushed away decades of dust and revealed a single engraved sentence. The inheritance was never the land. Wyatt stared at the words. A chill moved through him. Dad, what were you trying to tell me? He whispered. Shadow gave a quiet huff. Wyatt reached into his jacket and unfolded the letter once more. He read through several pages again, searching for something he might have missed. Then he found it. Near the bottom of page, written almost as an afterthought, his father had added a final note. When you reach the last door, remember what I taught you beside the river. Ownership fades. Stewardship remains. Wyatt closed his eyes. Instantly, a memory returned. He was 12 years old, standing beside his father near a narrow creek after spring runoff. He had asked why their family spent so much time repairing old fences and helping neighbors maintain property lines that did not belong to them. His father had smiled and replied, "Because some things are not given to us so we can own them, son. Some things are given to us so we can protect them." Wyatt opened his eyes. The words suddenly felt connected. He looked again at the metal plate. Then his attention shifted to a narrow groove beneath it. Something fit there. Something specific. Shadow suddenly turned and walked back toward the archive shelves. Wyatt followed. The German Shepherd moved directly to the cabinet labeled Legacy and sat beside the bottom drawer. Wyatt frowned. You already knew where to look, did you not? He opened the drawer. Inside were dozens of folders. Beneath them rested a small wooden box. Unlike everything else in the room, the box appeared polished and carefully preserved. Wyatt lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside lay a brass key attached to a leather tag. On the tag were two words written in his father's handwriting: "Keep faith." Wyatt stared at it for several seconds before laughing softly in disbelief. You planned every step. Shadow's tail moved once. Together they returned to the steel door. Wyatt inserted the brass key into the hidden groove. For a moment nothing happened. Then a deep mechanical sound echoed through the mountain. Somewhere beyond the wall, ancient gears began turning. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The steel door slowly unlocked with a heavy click. Wyatt felt his heartbeat quicken. Shadow stepped forward immediately. The door opened several inches on its own, revealing darkness beyond. Wyatt raised the lantern and looked inside. A larger chamber stretched ahead, far beyond what he expected. In the center stood a long stone table, and resting on that table, illuminated by the lantern's glow, was a single leather-bound ledger, waiting as though someone had placed it there yesterday. Wyatt stepped into the chamber, with Shadow close beside him. The room was larger than any of the others, nearly 40 feet across its ceiling. supported by massive stone arches carved directly into the mountain. Yet it was not the size of the room that held his attention. It was the ledger resting alone on the stone table. Everything about it suggested purpose, intention, as though someone had known exactly who would one day stand here. Wyatt approached slowly and placed the lantern beside it. The leather cover looked worn but carefully preserved. Across the front, embossed in faded gold letters, were the words Stewards of the Valley. Shadow sat quietly beside the table. Wyatt opened the ledger. The first pages contained names. Hundreds of names. Families who had lived throughout the valley over the past century. Farmers, ranchers, shop owners, teachers, veterans. Beside many names were handwritten notes describing hardships, property disputes, floods, droughts, and recoveries. Wyatt frowned. This is not a financial ledger. He turned more pages. Maps appeared. Land records, historical agreements, community projects, donations, quiet acts of generosity that had never been publicly acknowledged. Then he found a familiar name, Brooks. Several pages were dedicated to his family. He read carefully. Decades ago, his great-grandfather had helped establish a private trust designed to protect landowners from losing family property during difficult times. The trust quietly purchased endangered land, preserved records, and ensured rightful ownership could always be proven. Over the years, more families joined, more records were stored, more responsibilities were passed down. Wyatt slowly sat down. This is what Dad was protecting. The realization settled over him like sunlight breaking through clouds. The mountain was never built to hide treasure. It was built to protect history, to protect people, to protect truth. Shadow rested his head against Wyatt's arm. Wyatt smiled faintly. You brought me here for a reason, did not you? He continued reading. Near the end of the ledger, a sealed envelope had been tucked between two pages. His name appeared across the front. With steady hands, he opened it. Inside was a final letter. Son, if you have reached this room, then you already understand something your brother never did. Wealth is not measured by what a man owns. It is measured by what he preserves when no one is watching. Wyatt's eyes lingered on the words. The letter continued. The ranch was never the most valuable thing our family possessed. The records in this mountain protect thousands of acres, dozens of families, and generations of history. I chose you because you understand responsibility, not ownership, stewardship. Wyatt looked away from the page and stared into the lantern flame. For the first time since his father's death, the questions that had haunted him began to fade. This had never been about favoritism. It had never been about inheritance in the way Derek believed. His father had trusted him with something far greater. Shadow suddenly stood and walked toward the far side of the chamber. Wyatt followed his gaze. Built into the stone wall was a large wooden cabinet he had not noticed before. Its doors stood slightly open. Inside rested dozens of neatly organized folders, each containing certified records, trust documents, and legal ownership files. Wyatt stepped closer and pulled one folder free. The moment he opened it, his eyes widened. At the very top was a document bearing his father's signature, officially naming the next guardian of everything preserved within the mountain. And beneath that signature, already completed years before, was his own name. Morning sunlight poured through the windows of the stone house as Wyatt emerged from the mountain chambers. Several hours later, the storm had passed. Fresh snow covered the valley below like a white blanket stretching to the horizon. Shadow stood beside him on the porch, his breath drifting into the cold morning air. For a long time, neither moved. Wyatt simply looked across the mountains his father had spent so many years protecting. You knew, did not you? He said quietly. Shadow tilted his head. Wyatt smiled. Somehow I think you knew more than I did. Over the following weeks, Wyatt remained at the stone house. He repaired broken shutters, cleared snow from the pathways, restored rooms that had sat empty for decades. Each day he spent hours organizing the records hidden beneath the mountain. The more he learned, the more he understood the true purpose of what his father had left behind. It was not wealth, it was trust. One afternoon, a knock sounded at the front door. Wyatt opened it and found Derek standing outside. The older man looked different, tired, older than he had just weeks earlier. For several moments, neither brother spoke. Snowflakes drifted slowly between them. Finally, Derek lowered his eyes. I found Dad's last letter. Wyatt remained silent. Derek swallowed hard. He left it with the attorney. It arrived late. Wyatt waited. Derek looked toward the mountains. I did not understand what he was trying to do. His voice carried none of the certainty Wyatt remembered. I thought the ranch was everything. Shadow sat quietly beside the doorway watching. Derek glanced at the dog and managed a faint smile. Looks like he picked the right guide. Wyatt almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he stepped aside. Come in, it is cold out there. They spent several hours talking beside the fireplace, not arguing, not settling scores, simply talking. For the first time in years, they spoke honestly about their father, about mistakes, about regrets, and about the future. When Derek finally prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "You are not angry?" he asked. Wyatt looked toward Shadow, sleeping peacefully near the fire. Then he looked back at his brother. "Life is too short to spend it carrying things that heavy." Derek nodded slowly. Before leaving, he extended his hand. Wyatt shook it. No grand speeches followed, no dramatic reconciliation, just two brothers choosing a better path forward. Months later, spring arrived. Wildflowers appeared along the mountain slopes. The stone house became alive again. Families occasionally visited to research old records. Landowners recovered forgotten documents. Historical disputes were peacefully resolved. The trust continued exactly as Wyatt's father had intended. One evening, Wyatt sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Shadow rested beside him, older now but still alert whenever the wind moved through the trees. The valley below glowed gold beneath the fading light. Wyatt thought about the night he had walked away from everything he believed mattered. He had lost a house. He had lost an inheritance. He had lost the life he expected. Yet somehow, by losing those things, he had found something far greater. He reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears. "Thank you, partner." The German shepherd leaned gently against his leg. Together they watched the last sunlight disappear beyond the horizon. And for the first time in a very long while, Wyatt felt exactly where he belonged. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.